At the end of the 15th century, in the heart of the Vatican, the Pope lost the taste of bread and wine. His body was failing, but instead of repentance, he chose another path. At night, bodies of young boys vanished from Roman graveyards, and behind locked doors of the Apostolic Palace, physicians ground human flesh into powder. The Pope drank it as medicine, believing that with it he consumed life and holiness itself. He did grow stronger, while Rome grew weaker. When he died, his body was too heavy for its coffin, and years later, it refused to decompose. The Church calls it a mystery, but the truth is far more horrifying. Now you will discover exactly what happened, and why even death could not end this story. The first thing to vanish was the taste of bread. In the winter of 1487, within the sealed chambers of the Apostolic Palace, Pope Innocent VIII woke before dawn with a mouth that no longer recognized nourishment, only dust and iron, as if he had been chewing coins in his sleep. The ceiling above his bed loomed like a pale sky without mercy, its frescoed saints staring downward with expressions that now felt less like blessing and more like inventory. His tongue searched for memory and found nothing edible left in the world. The servants sensed the change before they named it. The air in the corridors thickened, not suddenly, but with the patience of rot. Incense still burned at its appointed hours, yet it no longer ruled the space. Beneath it crept another scent, sweet and cloying, the smell of opened earth and old skin, of something disturbed that had not agreed to stay buried. It clung to tapestries embroidered with victories and miracles, settled into the seams of marble floors, and followed the servants back to their quarters like an accusation. The Pope's body had begun to fail in small, precise ways. His hands trembled only when idle. His heartbeat stuttered at prayer, then steadied during meals he barely touched. Physicians were summoned quietly, men trained in both scripture and flesh, who approached the papal bed as one approaches an altar that might collapse. They examined his urine, his breath, the pallor beneath his eyes, and found nothing that fit neatly within God's design. Age should have weakened him uniformly, but instead parts of him seemed to be withdrawing while others waited, alert and hungry. Rome outside the palace moved as it always had, unaware that something within the Vatican had begun to lean inward on itself. Bells rang, markets shouted, and graves closed over fresh dead in the frozen ground. Inside, doors were locked more often, shutters drawn even at midday, and the Apostolic Palace took on the character of a body holding its breath. Prayers lengthened, meals shortened. The Pope's chambers became a place where time slowed, where even footsteps sounded hesitant, as though the stone itself were listening. At night, Innocent lay awake, aware not of pain but of absence. His stomach did not ache, it waited. His thoughts did not race, they circled, returning again and again to the same terrifying clarity. Whatever sustained him was no longer sufficient. Faith tasted thin. Bread tasted like ash. Wine carried no warmth. Somewhere beyond doctrine and law, a more primitive logic pressed forward, whispering that vitality was a substance, transferable, finite, and slipping through his fingers. By the end of that winter, the Pope no longer asked whether he would die. He asked only what could be taken before death arrived, and how quietly it could be done. Rome whispered that the Holy Father was dying, and the city had learned to whisper well. Rumors slid through taverns, confessionals, and candlelit corridors like oil through stone, never stopping long enough to be seized. Outside the Apostolic Palace, prayers were offered with a nervous urgency, as if devotion itself might be weighed and found insufficient. Inside, however, death was not an abstraction or a threat. It was a material, handled with care, processed behind sealed doors with the same solemn precision once reserved for relics. The physicians chosen for this work were not the most merciful, nor the most pious, but the most discreet. They moved through the palace at hours when shadows were longest, their boots muffled, their faces composed into expressions of professional emptiness. Each had studied the human body not only as a vessel of the soul, but as a system of parts, fluids, and residues, each capable of being repurposed. They believed, or convinced themselves to believe, that what they were about to do stood just beyond heresy, not fully within it. The difference mattered to them more than it ever would to history. The youths were selected carefully. They were not criminals, not malformed, not diseased. Their deaths had been recent, their bodies still holding the quiet tension of interrupted life. They were exhumed at night from churchyards that trusted the sanctity of Vatican seals. Earth was peeled back gently, reverently, as if the act itself were a form of prayer. When the coffins were opened, the cold air escaped first, followed by the unmistakable sweetness of flesh that had not yet accepted its fate. Transported through service passages and hidden stairwells, the bodies never touched consecrated ground again. They were brought to a chamber deep within the palace, a room once used for storing obsolete reliquaries and censored texts. There, beneath vaulted stone darkened by centuries of incense smoke, the physicians began their work. Bone was separated from tissue. Tissue was dried, shaved, reduced. Mortars and pestles ground what had once been muscle and marrow into a pale, fine powder that caught in the air like pollen. The room filled with a smell that no incense could mask, a mixture of sweetness and iron that settled into hair and skin, refusing to be scrubbed away. No prayers were spoken during the process. Silence ruled, broken only by the steady rhythm of grinding and the soft scrape of tools against stone. The physicians avoided one another's eyes, not out of shame, but out of preservation. To acknowledge another mind fully engaged in the same act was to risk understanding it too clearly. Understanding, they knew, had weight, and weight could crush. When the powder was complete, it was measured with an apothecary's precision. Too much would poison. Too little would be meaningless. The balance was delicate, terrifyingly so. Wine was warmed, honey added to thicken it, to soften the bitterness that could not be entirely disguised. The mixture took on a faintly luminous quality in candlelight, swirling slowly, as if resisting stillness. It looked less like a drink than a suspension, something waiting to be awakened. The Pope received it without ceremony. The cup was raised to his lips by steady hands, and he swallowed with the discipline of a man long accustomed to ritual. The liquid slid down his throat, heavy and warm, coating him from within. It did not burn. It did not choke. Instead, it spread, a quiet heat blooming behind his sternum, radiating outward in slow, deliberate waves. For the first time in months, his fingers stopped trembling. His breath deepened. His heart, which had stuttered and faltered, settled into a rhythm that felt borrowed, unfamiliar, yet powerful. Those who observed him in the hours that followed noticed the change immediately. Color returned to his cheeks, not the flush of fever, but something denser, more controlled. His eyes sharpened, reflecting candlelight with a clarity that unsettled even the most seasoned attendants. He slept deeply that night, and when he woke, the smell in his chamber had changed. It was no longer only rot and incense. There was something else threaded through it now, something vital and invasive, like the scent of freshly turned soil after rain. The physicians wrote nothing. Parchment remained untouched. Quills stayed dry. What they had witnessed did not want language. Any attempt to fix it into words would have transformed it from necessity into crime. Instead, they burned their preparatory notes, fed them to the hearth until ash floated upward and disappeared into the darkened flue. They washed their hands repeatedly, water reddening, then clearing, then reddening again as skin cracked and bled. Cleanliness became a ritual of denial. Outside the Pope's chambers, the palace reacted as living structures due to internal change. Corridors seemed warmer. Echoes lingered longer than they should have. Servants reported feeling watched not by eyes, but by the walls themselves, as if stone and fresco had grown attentive. Tapestries depicting martyrdom and ascension appeared darker, their woven faces more intent. No one spoke of these sensations openly. To do so would have required naming their cause, and naming remained dangerous. Rome continued to whisper of decline, of imminent vacancy, of preparations quietly underway for mourning. The truth moved in the opposite direction, gaining momentum behind sealed doors. Another mixture was prepared days later, then another. Each time, the Pope grew stronger, and each time, the physicians felt the distance between their actions and their justifications widen. Salvation, they had thought, could be swallowed. What they were witnessing now felt less like salvation and more like extraction. By the end of that season, death had not been delayed. It had been harnessed, broken down into components, measured, and fed into a body that refused to relinquish authority. And those who had made it possible understood, with a growing, suffocating clarity, that they were no longer healers. They were suppliers. The second act began when the Pope stopped weakening, and the palace noticed before the city did. His skin, once thin and translucent, tightened as though drawn inward by an invisible hand, smoothing over veins that had begun to rise like blue threads beneath parchment flesh. The sag at his jaw receded. The hollows beneath his eyes filled. When he walked, his steps no longer dragged or hesitated but landed with deliberate weight, a quiet authority returning to bones that had prepared themselves for surrender. Those closest to him felt an instinctive unease, the same discomfort one feels when a corpse is discovered warm. His eyes changed most of all. Where once they had filmed over with exhaustion, they now caught light sharply, reflecting candle flames with a brightness that suggested appetite rather than awareness. They followed movement with precision, lingering not on faces but on throats, hands, the subtle pulse beneath skin. The physicians recorded none of this, yet each carried the image away with him, lodged behind the eyes like a second conscience that would not sleep. The apostolic palace responded as living things respond to internal alteration. Heat collected in corridors that had always been cold, lingering even at night when stone should have exhaled the day's warmth. Walls seemed to hold breath, releasing it slowly, deliberately. Servants complained of dizziness, of sweat beading on their backs during the simplest tasks. The scent that permeated the halls deepened, losing any pretense of accident. Incense no longer masked corruption but fused with it, resin and rot woven together into something heavier, more persistent. It settled into lungs and throats, coating the tongue with sweetness that lingered long after leaving the palace. Innocent felt the change with a clarity that bordered on revelation. Prayer no longer exhausted him. It energized, sharpened his thoughts, focused his hunger. Fasting became intolerable, not because of weakness, but because it interrupted a new internal rhythm that demanded consistency. The mixtures arrived more frequently, prepared with greater confidence, their contents more refined. Each ingestion carried the same spreading warmth, now familiar, now anticipated. He learned to recognize its arrival by the way his spine straightened, by the subtle tightening of his grip on the armrests of his chair. Somewhere between prayer and digestion, a new certainty took hold. Sanctity, he decided, was not metaphor. It was not merely bestowed or imagined. It was housed. It resided in flesh, in blood, in the tension of muscle and the integrity of bone. Saints did not ascend because of belief alone. They were constructed, molecule by molecule, through discipline and sacrifice. If holiness could animate a body to defy decay, then decay itself must be the inverse, a failure of preservation rather than proof of divine will. This logic took root quickly, spreading through his thoughts with the same efficiency as the warmth through his veins. Doctrine bent around it, reshaping itself to accommodate necessity. The Church had always venerated relics, fragments of bodies preserved and displayed as conduits of grace. What difference, then, existed between reverence and consumption, between proximity and absorption? If the faithful touched bone to be healed, why should the vicar of Christ not take that holiness inward, where it could do the most good? The physicians sensed the shift in him, though none dared articulate it. His questions changed. He asked about timing, about preservation, about quality. He wanted to know how long vitality remained accessible after death, what conditions degraded it, what signs indicated potency rather than mere tissue. Their answers grew cautious, stripped of speculation, yet even restraint felt dangerous. Each response confirmed what he already believed, that life could be extracted, transferred, consolidated. Rome, meanwhile, continued its routines, unaware that its spiritual center had begun to reinterpret the body as resource. Graves were still dug. Funerals still processed through narrow streets. The dead were mourned, prayed over, surrendered. But somewhere beneath the rituals, an invisible selection had begun. Certain deaths were noted. Certain bodies were remembered longer than others. Records shifted subtly, altered not by ink but by omission, by attention directed elsewhere. Within the palace, Innocent's presence grew heavier, more dominant. Audiences left his chambers shaken, unable to name why. He listened intently, his focus unbroken, as though every petition were an opportunity to measure vigor, to assess what remained unclaimed in the world around him. His hands rested calmly on the arms of his chair, fingers no longer twitching, nails clean and pale. His breathing deepened, slower and more controlled, each inhalation drawn with intention. At night, sleep came swiftly and without dreams, a dense unconsciousness that felt earned rather than forced. When he woke, it was without confusion, his thoughts aligned and ordered. The sense of absence that had haunted him months earlier was gone, replaced by a fullness that pressed outward, demanding expression. The hunger did not vanish, it refined itself. It became specific, discerning, intolerant of substitutes. The palace staff adjusted without discussion. New routes were taken through the building. Certain doors remained locked. Certain chambers were avoided entirely. The physicians found their authority shifting. They were no longer advisors but instruments, necessary yet increasingly irrelevant to the decisions being made. They watched the Pope move with a confidence that bordered on possession and understood that what they had initiated was no longer within their control. Even the sacred spaces responded. In chapels where Innocent knelt, candles burned lower and steadier, flames drawn inward as if reluctant to flicker. Stone floors retained warmth long after he departed. The silence that followed him was not reverent but expectant, thick with the impression that something had passed through and might return at any moment. By the close of that period, weakness had become a memory rather than a threat. Age had been interrupted, not reversed but reorganized, its authority challenged by a logic older and more brutal than faith. Innocent no longer feared death as an ending. He regarded it as a process, one that could be delayed, redirected, even harvested. And in that conviction, unspoken yet absolute, the transformation completed itself. The Pope had not merely survived his decline. He had redefined what survival meant. Rome paid the price quietly, because Rome had always learned how to suffer without spectacle. The disturbances began beyond the reach of daylight, in peripheral places where grief had not yet hardened into memory. Graves shifted subtly, soil pressed back not by animals or weather, but by careful hands that worked quickly and left little trace. Coffins were opened and closed with reverence that felt rehearsed, as if the act itself had been practiced elsewhere, refined through repetition. By morning, the earth appeared undisturbed, yet something essential had been removed, a subtraction that left families uneasy without knowing why. Records changed without ink. Names that had been entered were no longer emphasized. Deaths that should have attracted attention were folded into the vast arithmetic of the city. Clerks discovered that certain ledgers no longer aligned with memory, yet when questioned, the discrepancy dissolved into uncertainty. Indulgences were granted generously, offered to grieving families as gestures of compassion, absolution pressed into trembling hands with practiced gentleness. Those who hesitated felt pressure applied with equal care, threats softened into counsel, mercy sharpened into warning. Silence was framed as protection, compliance as faith. The city grew thinner. This was not famine, not plague, not anything that could be pointed to or named. It was a diminishment that spread unevenly, visible in the pallor of faces, in the slowness of steps, in the way laughter shortened and conversations lost their weight. Tradesmen complained of exhaustion that rest did not resolve. Laborers found their strength fading by mid-morning. Children slept longer, ate less, stared more. Rome continued to function, but its pulse weakened, as though something vital were being drawn elsewhere. That elsewhere was the apostolic palace, which now felt dense with presence. The Pope's body responded to the influx with an efficiency that unsettled even those who had enabled it. His movements acquired a precision that bordered on mechanical, gestures executed with perfect economy. He rose, walked, knelt, and turned with a timing so exact it seemed measured against an internal metronome. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, no visible fatigue. Watching him was like observing a mechanism newly assembled, its parts still unfamiliar, but functioning flawlessly. Physicians began to fear the rhythm of his movements more than any symptom they could have named. The body they attended no longer behaved as a singular entity. It responded in layers, adjustments rippling through muscle and tendon with delays too brief to register consciously, yet impossible to ignore. When he reached for an object, the motion appeared to begin before the decision, as though intention and action had been separated and then reunited imperfectly. It felt as if several lifetimes were rehearsing inside one failing body, overlapping, competing, aligning, and misaligning in rapid succession. They noted changes they did not record. His grip strength increased, but not uniformly. Certain fingers bore more force than others. His posture shifted subtly from day to day, as if experimenting with different centers of balance. His breathing patterns altered without external cause, deepening, shallowing, pausing at irregular intervals that nonetheless resolved into stability. None of this suggested illness. It suggested adaptation, an organism testing parameters, discarding inefficiencies. The palace adapted with him. Guards reported an increased sense of alertness without clear reason. Servants felt compelled to adjust routines, arriving earlier, leaving later, unable to explain the compulsion. Rooms nearest the Pope's chambers retained heat unnaturally, the air thick and resistant, as though it had been compressed. Candles burned more slowly there, their flames steady and narrow, refusing to gutter even when drafts should have disturbed them. Beyond the palace walls, the effects accumulated. Cemeteries felt watched, not by eyes but by attention, a pressure that lingered long after night work ceased. Priests administering last rites experienced a hollowing sensation, a sense that something essential was already absent from the dying. Confessionals grew colder. Churches filled, yet prayer felt thinner, stretched, as if too many mouths were drawing from a limited reservoir. Families noticed the change in their own bodies before they noticed it in the city. A father's strength failed sooner than expected. A mother's recovery from childbirth slowed. Youths once robust took ill without cause, their vitality leaching away in increments too small to provoke alarm, yet too persistent to ignore. Physicians outside the Vatican found no pattern they could trace. The city seemed intact. The numbers did not lie, and yet something was missing. Inside the Pope's chambers, that something accumulated. Innocent carried himself with a weight that was no longer symbolic. His presence pressed outward, filling spaces, commanding attention without effort. When he sat, the chair seemed to accept him reluctantly, would creaking under a burden it had not been designed to bear. When he stood, the air around him felt disturbed, as if displaced by mass rather than motion. The physicians began to dream of him, though they shared no details with one another. Each dream carried the same impression: multiplicity contained by force, order imposed upon chaos through consumption. They woke with their hearts racing, their bodies heavy, as though they themselves had been measured and found insufficient. Some considered withdrawing, retreating into illness or duty elsewhere. None succeeded. Obligation bound them more tightly than fear. The logic that had once justified necessity now revealed its cost. Vitality was finite. What was gathered had to come from somewhere. The Pope's strength did not manifest in isolation. It cast a shadow, and that shadow stretched across Rome. Yet even as this realization took shape, it failed to slow the process. The mechanisms were in motion, sustained by secrecy, authority, and the terrible clarity of results. Innocent did not speak of the city's thinning, but his awareness of it was unmistakable. His gaze lingered longer on reports of illness, of unexplained deaths, of communities growing quiet, not with concern, but with calculation. The Church, he believed, had always demanded sacrifice. Rome was merely participating more directly now, contributing substance rather than symbol. By the end of that period, the balance had shifted irrevocably. The Pope's body stood as proof of success, undeniable and terrifying. The city bore the cost without uprising, without scream, absorbing the loss as it had absorbed so many before. And those closest to the truth understood, with a dread that settled into bone, that what had begun as an attempt to defy death had become something far worse, a system that required continual extraction, a rhythm that could not be interrupted without consequence. The collapse did not come with repentance, but with excess, because repentance required restraint, and restraint had already been consumed. Innocent no longer waited for the mixtures to be prepared with care. He demanded them with impatience, measuring time not by hours or prayers, but by the intervals between ingestion. More powder, more purity, more youth. The words never spoken aloud yet communicated with unmistakable urgency through glance and gesture. What had once been a calculated ritual became routine, then necessity, then compulsion. The mixtures changed in character. Where they had once been thin and warming, they grew dense, almost viscous, clinging to the sides of the cup like something reluctant to move. The sweetness of honey curdled on his tongue, turning bitter before it could be swallowed, yet he drank anyway, forcing the substance down with the same authority he applied to doctrine. The warmth still came, but it arrived unevenly now, pooling in the chest, burning behind the eyes, leaving limbs alternately heavy and sharp. The rhythm that had once felt precise began to stutter. The physicians noticed first in the smallest details. His breathing, once controlled, deepened too far, then caught unexpectedly. His pulse, previously steady, began to layer over itself, multiple tempos colliding beneath the skin. His hands sometimes moved before his eyes focused, sometimes lagged behind intention entirely. The body that had learned to adapt now struggled to coordinate its borrowed abundance. Faith had already condemned what flesh was beginning to reject. The body, unlike doctrine, did not negotiate. It processed until it could not. The first failure came quietly, a subtle faltering in digestion, the warmth no longer dispersing but concentrating, creating pressure that had nowhere to go. The second followed in the blood, thickness increasing, circulation slowing, as if the body were attempting to hoard what it could no longer distribute safely. Organs failed in sequence, not chaos. The liver resisted first, swelling, darkening, refusing to refine what it was being fed. The kidneys followed, filtration slowing, then stalling, waste accumulating with a patience that mirrored the earlier harvest. The heart compensated longer than it should have, driven by layers of vitality that did not belong to it, beating with a strength that strained its own structure. Each failure closed like a door being locked from the inside, deliberate and final. The smell returned before the pain. It seeped from Innocent's chambers in waves, rolling through corridors that had grown accustomed to corruption and found this new scent intolerable. It was not the sharpness of fresh decay nor the sweetness of rot, but something preserved too long, something ancient held unnaturally intact. Servants pressed cloth to their mouths as they passed, eyes watering, stomachs tightening, unable to reconcile the scent with the living body that still occupied the bed. Inside, Innocent remained lucid longer than anyone expected. His mind, sharpened by months of extraction, catalogued the failures with unsettling calm. He felt systems shutting down, one by one, and recognized the pattern not as punishment, but as consequence. What he had consumed had not been infinite. What he had gathered had not been meant to coexist. The multiplicity he had forced into himself no longer aligned. It pulled inward, competing, compressing, demanding space that did not exist. The physicians could do nothing. Remedies failed to circulate. Bleeding produced little change. Prayers hung in the air, thin and decorative. They watched the Pope's body become heavy in the bed, density increasing as though gravity itself had taken interest. When he slept, it was shallow and brief. When he woke, his eyes were bright with a focus that bordered on mania, scanning the room as if searching for something left unfinished. By the time summer settled over Rome in 1492, the palace felt suffocated by presence and decay in equal measure. Windows were opened, then closed again, the heat carrying the scent farther rather than dispersing it. Even the stones seemed to sweat. Tapestries darkened at the edges, threads absorbing what the air refused to release. The city outside sensed the change instinctively, prayer giving way to anticipation, bells tolling with a heaviness that felt premature. Death arrived not as a moment, but as a process reaching its conclusion. Innocent's body continued to operate after authority had left it, reflexes firing without coordination, breath drawn without purpose. When the heart finally failed, it did so reluctantly, contracting once more than expected, as if testing whether command might return. It did not. The silence that followed was immediate and oppressive. Those present felt it press against their ears, a vacuum created by the sudden absence of the force that had dominated the space. The smell intensified, no longer contained by living skin, escaping fully now, filling the chamber with a stench that caused some to retch and others to freeze. It was the odor of preservation collapsing, of decay released after prolonged restraint. Preparation of the body began at once, yet even this familiar ritual resisted expectation. The corpse was heavier than it should have been, difficult to lift, reluctant to yield to hands that had moved countless dead before. The skin had taken on a leathery density, neither supple nor brittle. When washed, it did not cool as quickly as it should have, retaining warmth in pockets that confused and unsettled those attending it. As the body was dressed and arranged, the smell persisted, refusing incense, resisting herbs. It lingered in the folds of fabric, in the hair, in the air above the corpse like an accusation that could not be silenced. Those who worked closest felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the density that had weighed upon the living pope now pressed outward, testing the limits of the space. By nightfall, the chamber was sealed. Guards were posted not out of ceremony but necessity, instructed to prevent entry rather than honor the dead. The palace exhaled slowly, releasing some of the pressure it had carried for so long, though the relief was incomplete. Something had been broken that could not be repaired through succession or prayer. Rome received the news with practiced solemnity. Bells rang. Black cloth appeared. Mourning was declared. The city did not know what it had lost, only that something essential had been taken and then returned in ruin. The thinning that had plagued it for months did not immediately reverse. Strength did not rush back. Instead, there was exhaustion, deep and collective, as if the city itself had survived an illness it could not name. Innocent was dead, yet the consequences of his excess remained suspended in the air, clinging to stone and memory. What he had attempted had failed, but not cleanly. Decay had been delayed, redirected, concentrated, and when it finally emerged, it did so with a force that left no doubt. This was not the end of the transgression. It was merely the point at which it could no longer be hidden within a living body. After burial, the Vatican moved with practiced urgency to seal the story, as if speed itself could cauterize what had been exposed. Orders were issued without signatures. Testimonies were redirected into silence. Autopsies were forbidden not by decree but by atmosphere, by the unmistakable understanding that certain questions no longer belonged to the living. The body was interred quickly, wrapped in layers of ritual meant to stabilize reality itself, yet even in death Innocent resisted reduction. Those who carried the corpse to its resting place felt it immediately. The weight was wrong, not merely heavy, but dense in a way that defied proportion, as though the body contained more mass than it visually possessed. Pallbearers strained, their muscles trembling, breath shortening, and several later reported the same sensation, that something inside the remains pressed back, settling, shifting, refusing to be merely transported. None spoke of it publicly. All remembered it with clarity that sharpened over time rather than faded. The tomb was sealed beneath stone and ceremony, incense thick enough to sting the eyes, prayers layered until they blurred into a single droning sound. When the final slab was lowered, the air seemed to resist, a subtle pressure change that caused candles to flicker and then steady again. The chamber was closed. Guards were dismissed. The church exhaled, convinced that enclosure equaled resolution. But damage does not require witnesses to continue its work. In the months that followed, Rome did not immediately recover. Strength returned unevenly, slowly, as though vitality had to relearn where it belonged. Some ailments faded. Others lingered without explanation. Certain neighborhoods remained quieter than before, conversations shorter, laughter hesitant. The thinning reversed, but not cleanly. Something had been displaced, and displacement left residue. Inside the Vatican, records were reorganized. Correspondence vanished. Ledgers were corrected retroactively, deaths aligned with expectation rather than reality. Physicians involved in the matter were reassigned, retired, or quietly absorbed into other duties where their knowledge could dissolve into irrelevance. None ever spoke openly of what they had done. None were asked. Years passed, and Innocent became a name smoothed by distance, his reign reduced to manageable controversies and administrative footnotes. The story was contained, as stories often are, not by denial but by dilution. Generations shifted, priorities changed. The tomb remained sealed and unremarkable, one among many. It was during renovations decades later, undertaken without ceremony or anticipation, that the past refused to remain dormant. Stonework beneath the basilica required inspection, and Innocent's tomb fell within the area marked for evaluation. The decision was procedural, not symbolic. No one involved expected anything beyond dust and bone. When the tomb was opened, the air that escaped was familiar to no one present and deeply unsettling to all of them. It was not the sharp odor of decay long past, nor the neutrality of ancient remains. It carried the same preserved wrongness that had once haunted the apostolic palace, a scent caught between states, neither living nor dead. Those closest to the opening stepped back instinctively, hands rising to their mouths, eyes watering without understanding why. The remains inside were intact to a degree that violated expectation. Flesh clung to bone where it should have long since surrendered. It was darkened, leathery, dense, resisting the natural timeline of dissolution with stubborn coherence. The bones themselves were stained, not by soil or moisture, but by something internal, a deep discoloration that suggested prolonged saturation. There was no evidence of preservation techniques, no embalming, no intervention that could account for what lay before them. The body appeared compressed, as though it had settled inward over time rather than collapsed. Limbs retained form. The skull bore no fractures, no signs of compromise. Even the hands, folded as tradition dictated, resisted separation, fingers stiff yet intact, joints holding as if tension remained. It did not look peaceful. It looked contained. Those present did not linger. The tomb was resealed swiftly, explanations drafted with care. Official records noted an anomaly, a curiosity, a reminder of the unpredictability of natural processes. The Church declared it a mystery, and as it had done for centuries, it moved on. But mysteries have weight, and this one lingered. The scent returned periodically to those who had been present, unbidden, surfacing in memory at moments of stillness. It appeared in dreams, in the quiet spaces between thought and sleep, carrying with it the impression of pressure rather than presence. Some reported sensations of heaviness in the chest when passing near the tomb, a subtle resistance in the air that made breathing feel deliberate rather than automatic. Others felt nothing at all, which unsettled them more. The truth, though never spoken, remained intact in fragments scattered among those who had touched the edges of it. Innocent had not merely sought to delay death. He had attempted to incorporate it, to digest sanctity itself, to make eternity portable. What he consumed had not vanished. It had reorganized, condensed, embedded itself into matter that refused to behave as matter should. The Church endured, as it always had, its continuity unbroken by the transgressions of individual men. Doctrine adjusted. History narrowed. Innocent's name faded into academic context, his excesses absorbed into the vast archive of papal eccentricities. The institution survived precisely because it did not dwell. Yet the lesson remained, etched not in text, but in stone and flesh. There are limits that cannot be crossed without consequence, thresholds that do not forgive ambition cloaked as faith. To consume what was never meant to be possessed is to invite a permanence more terrible than death. Somewhere beneath layers of marble and prayer, Innocent lay unchanged, carrying within him the residue of stolen vitality, compressed into a form that neither lived nor properly decayed. He had tried to eat eternity, to draw it inward and command it as he had commanded men and doctrine. For a moment, eternity had yielded, and then, patiently, it had bitten back.